Okay, so in part three, I want to touch a little bit more on Bourdieu's ideas of symbolic violence and distinction and show you an example of that. And then talk a little bit about how Bourdieu's work in terms of distinction is dated a little bit because it focused on a distinction between high and low culture, but then highlight how his ideas are still really, I think, useful for thinking about pop culture and consumer culture. And then in the last part, I'm going to move away from specifically Bourdieusian ideas, talk a little bit about some developments around post-Bourdieu's ideas about lifestyle, and then talk about how the very notion of reflexivity challenges some of these ways of thinking, but also reinforces it as well. So the key way of thinking, Bourdieusian thinking in consumer culture, relates to these notions of distinction and symbolic violence. Again, distinction is this kind of taste classifiers and it classifies the classifier thing. Symbolic violence, though, is a really key term here in terms of how the dissemination of power and experience of that inequality is done through these cultural processes. For Bourdieu, symbolic violence is a kind of feeling that you experience when you can't really participate in something legitimately, or you feel like you may be underdressed in a situation, or that you don't know how to use the particular fork, or in a fancy restaurant, or you go to an art gallery and you don't really feel like you have the knowledge to engage with the conceptual art or whatever. This experience and this feeling, these emotions that this has brought up when you feel like this kind of fish out of water, particularly when it comes around your knowledge and taste about things, and particularly when you're in a marginalized position in that kind of hierarchy, is what Bourdieu wants us to think about when it comes to symbolic violence. So in broad terms here, symbolic violence is experienced mostly by those with less cultural capital, with less knowledge about these kind of legitimate hierarchies, or of what are legitimate and what's cool and all that kind of stuff and what's not. So it is related to economic power, but as Bourdieu's more complex class system than that of, say, Marx and even that of Weber, really, people, say, with relatively well paid but not rich, will have a significant amount of cultural power and cultural capital. So again, people in the media industries and academics and stuff like that can have influence here that aren't necessarily on $1 million a year. They're getting well paid, but they're not particularly high in cultural capital. So also what Bourdieu wants us to think about here is symbolic violence is something that those experiencing it sometimes almost voluntarily participate in because they misrecognize their own position. So importantly here, in particular fields, it means that there's struggles going on about what's good and bad, or what can be successful or not. But when you're participating in it as an individual, you often don't, kind of realize that the situation you're in is the result of history and struggles and the way that people have struggled in the past. So there's a kind of misrecognition that goes on there where these symbolic hierarchies are misrecognized as a form of social order, where one's position in it isn't really reflected upon until you experience this symbolic violence. And as Bourdieu and other studies since his work shows, often results in people trying to exclude themselves so they don't experience those emotions anymore. So the pursuit of distinction here is not just the development of taste. It's not only conceptual, it's corporeal. And what that means here, it's about the body. It's about how one feels and the emotions experienced through language, gestures, body language, and fashion. And if you have a particular amount of cultural capital knowledge in a particular situation, you'll feel at home. You'll feel like you're getting along with everyone. You'll feel like a fish in water. If you don't so much, if you're wearing the wrong clothes, or don't understand that, I don't know, in a particular field that wide ties are in instead of skinny ties or something, that kind of stuff will make you feel more excluded and on the outskirts of that social situation. So symbolic violence is experienced by those in their everyday taste, when their everyday taste is marginalised, criticised, and seen as illegitimate, crude, and vulgar. So have a look at the papers that I've put in this week in the extra readings. Barbara Pinney's work about cashed up bogans is really good. Angela McRobbie's work about reality television, and Beverly Skeggs' work about reality television, about what not to wear, and the way that working class women increasingly become the object of disgust in those kind of things. They're really good examples of what distinction and symbolic violence can kind of be thought of in the research. They're really good research about that stuff. So in terms of an example here, maybe just to kind of illustrate it, I might just get you to pause the lecture here for a minute, get the link from the lecture notes, and have a look at that example from The Wire there. And in that, there's a kind of an authority figure rewards some kids for doing a good job. By doing so, he takes them to a fancy restaurant, but very quickly the reward starts to feel like a punishment because they don't really understand what's expected of them in that situation. There's all the knives and forks that they don't get. They can't order the food they actually want, and very quickly they reject what's going on there. They refuse what they've already been refused from. So I think that the uncomfortableness that's expressed in that, fictional example, no doubt, but you could relate it to the wider world, is a good expression of how symbolic violence works to exclude. So just have a quick look at that, and then I'll move on. So I want to just quickly sum up Bourdieu here. So for Bourdieu, all human action takes place within fields. These fields are arena for struggle over kind of resources, scarce resources. But this is metaphorical in many ways. The resources aren't just about acquiring stuff. They can also be struggles over forms of knowledge and defining taste and that kind of thing. So resources there is a metaphor about kind of being able to kind of, I suppose, make the world in your own image and having the kind of resources to do that. Individuals and institutions and other agents try to distinguish themselves from others, in those modes of distinction, and they do this through their cultural capital and through the struggles over cultural capital as well. In terms of the way Bourdieu wants to think about analysing societies, there's two distinct kind of levels. There's the economic, and this kind of relates to that Marx positions and power are determined by money and property. But to move beyond that, there's this kind of cultural and symbolic system that kind of doesn't directly overlay and don't directly reflect who has economic capital, but it kind of then reinforces that system to reproduce the class relationships overall. So where wealth is a form of domination, so is culture in this sense. But unlike the kind of Frankfurt School idea that the people that are, aren't the ruling class, everyone else is kind of cultural dupes, Bourdieu's position wants us to think about how people aren't really cultural dupes. They're not kind of totally ideologically tricked. That we're born into the world in a particular time and place, and we're likely to make decisions and to invest ourselves in struggles that reflect, our position in the world. And as I'll talk about in a minute, the notion of reflexivity might allow us to think about sometimes we actually realise that we're exploited and alienated, but we kind of make decisions to get on with life anyway. So Bourdieu argued in distinction that taste is acquired through notions of cultural competence, but this reflects particularly those that get to have parents with more cultural capital, get a better education, get to go to the right universities and stuff like that. So taste here functions as modes of distinction that kind of set up relationships where those with more cultural capital and symbolic power are the ones to get to define what's tasteful, what's moral, what's legitimate, what's cool, and all that kind of thing. So in terms of consumer culture, distinction was mostly a study between those that consumed high culture, literature, opera, stuff like that, and pop culture. And there was a kind of distinction between the middle classes and the working classes there. Today, that distinction between high and low culture still exists, but really most people, regardless of class, are consuming popular culture, particularly as, high culture like, literature and opera or whatever have had to kind of, take on more aspects of popular culture and the culture industries to survive, really. And so much of the way that Bourdieu is used today is to look at the distinctions within pop culture and consumer culture rather than kind of defining a kind of high pop culture distinction. And interestingly here too, that people from in different classes may well be consuming the same thing. The Bourdieusian analysis here will look that maybe they're consuming them differently. That say, reality television might be consumed more ironically than some groups of people than others and things like that. So Bourdieu's work's been widely used across a whole realm of different fields to look at education and politics and art and photography, but it has been profoundly influential in looking at consumer culture. And people that use Bourdieu to look at consumer culture look at it at multiple levels. They look at the different ways people consume, they look at the different ways that cultural policy affects people's taste or the very availability of different kinds of culture. They use Bourdieu's work to look at particular subcultures, whether that's, punk or whatever, and tries to kind of use those concepts to uncover the working logics and practices that are happening there. Again, here, this is a much more like anthropological understanding of cultures rather than that more philosophical elitist notion from the Frankfurt School. It wants us to think about how we participate in these things in everyday life, and why there's obviously ideological components to that, there's other things going on that are just as important. So he shows how processes of socialisation provide us with ways of seeing and feeling the world, but these aren't totally deterministic in that ideological sense. If you're born into a particular class, it doesn't completely determine who you are and who you're going to be, in this Bourdieusian perspective. He highlights the importance of the way that culture maintains social inequality, but also it's really important in terms of the way that we construct our sense of self. And what that can mean is if people are in kind of discriminated, marginalised positions in terms of their cultural consumption, this can reinforce the class system in terms of the way that people take on that notion that they may be not as cool or not as legitimate or less moral and less vulgar. And there can be kind of a labelling process there where that's kind of turned inward into the way that people think about themselves. Bourdieu wants us to think really about how there's the hierarchies and taste cultures that we have really turn the arbitrary into these hierarchies, that much of the hierarchies that we have around what's good and bad, what's tasteful and disgusting, what's moral and immoral, are reflections of social power. They're not innate. So this really makes the notions of status really important to thinking about those power relationships within culture, and how taste becomes a form of classification where cultural capital is really central to those that get to both know about these important things and define what's important itself. This relates then to the ways that inequality is actually experienced in the day-to-day moments of life, how even small notions of the way that language is used can be a real affront to the way that people experience popular culture, and they may therefore exclude themselves from it. So Bourdieu has been profoundly important here, as I've kind of been saying, and then throughout the kind of 80s and 90s, as consumer culture became, ever more important thing to study, there's this notion of lifestyle was developed. Now this kind of relates to Bourdieu in many ways, but it moves away particularly from focusing on just class and taste, and brings in wider notions of things like gender and race and ethnicity and religion, but also things like distinctions between urban, suburban and rural consumption. So certainly this kind of where Bourdieu's work particularly was about what was going on in France in terms of a nation state, and much research influenced by Bourdieu has tended to focus on what's going on in particular countries. The notion of lifestyle tries to bring in notions of globalization to move beyond those national borders and to think about how there's a whole kind of cultural economy that crosses those things. The understandings here is that class is still really important to think about consumption, but there's really blurry edges between social groups in terms of the way that society has become more complex. So we can think here about how, again, elements of cultural capital and your position in social space is really important in terms of the lifestyles you pursue. But lifestyles kind of, in this argument, break some of those kind of class and status boundaries. So we'll look at a whole week at Daniel Miller's work later on, who talks about how there's kind of a ritual around consumption, and particularly through the notion of the gift. Lurie talks about positional consumption. Consumption's about acquiring, using, exchanging things that individuals come to have in their social lives. Again, this is playing off the relationship between self and social identity. And Mary Douglas's work is kind of interesting here. She talks about there's a semiotic richness going on in consumption, where you need to learn the code to consume, and knowing the code or not leads to membership in some groups of others. There's a tyranny of surveillance between groups. Again, that taste classifies the classifier. But we don't just belong to one group here. We in our lives will belong to multiple groups, and whether that's your group of work friends might be different from the friends you associate with on the weekend, to a group of people you might play sport with, to your family. This kind of makes that kind of class position a little bit more blurry, because we'll be associating with people and different people based on that. But this sets us up in a kind of lifestyle where we pursue various, consumer products or consumer activities or popular culture, and we create, our social and our self identities through pursuing a particular kind of lifestyle. Another theoretical area here is the notion that the rise of reflexivity, that as, again, you would have looked at this in Soccer 1010, as societies become more complex, as globalization brings more and more kind of different forms of culture together, as we're saturated in the media, and all that kind of thing, there's a kind of need for individuals to be more reflexive about themselves. So the Borgesian analysis kind of points to the idea that, that kind of form of distinction happens almost instinctively, because we're socialized into it and it's common sense and we don't think about it too much, and we're just kind of forced to be who we are in a particular position. This point of view wants us to think more about how today we might actually actively construct our self-identity, but we do this in particular constraints. So there's like a flux and fixity here going on between who we choose to be and what we want to do, but also, again, through that social gravity about, what we can and can't do and how we're pushed and pulled by forces beyond our control. The rise of kind of lifestyle advocates and coaches here are really important. We kind of turn to experts more and more, personal trainers, stylists, dietitians, ads and magazines, these kind of stuff, to influence and give us advice about how to be the consumer to lead to the lifestyle that we want. So this idea kind of challenges some of those Borgesian ideas that kind of taste as the habitual product of our position in social space and totally related to class. Now, I would argue that it's still heavily related to class, but reflexivity kind of opens up some of these things and allows us maybe to think a little bit constructively about, as individuals, about how we want to position ourselves in the world. We're still profoundly influenced by the way we're socialized, where we are, and who surrounds us. And so we can't just totally be who we want to be, but bringing the idea of reflexivity in here allows us to kind of think about how people kind of struggle and make choices to try and, present themselves to the world in a particular way, and they regulate the way that they do that in particular parts of their lives. So again, the lifestyle here model of how we kind of think about this opens that up a little bit more. Again, I would particularly point to the work of Beverly Skeggs and Angela McRobbie here, who bring in notions of reflexivity to think about this stuff. So again, have a look at the reading list about that. So again, in the broader sense, situating this in between that social and self-identity, the ideas I've looked at this week are a kind of way of kind of thinking about that dichotomy and hopefully really moving beyond it. The notions of habitus and reflexivity and how we behave in particular fields can particularly be useful for moving on that dichotomy between social and self-identity and agency and structure, I suppose. So to conclude here, in Western materialist societies, an individual's identity is influenced by the symbolic meanings of his or her own material possessions and the way in which he or she relates to those possessions. Material possessions also serve as an expression of group membership and as a means of locating others in the social material environment. Moreover, material possessions provide people with information about other people's identities. So again, here we're moving back to that taste classifies and it classifies the classifier. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.